So, Ryan, what the hell is happening in Lebanon right now?
Well, you see, David, Lebanon is really not having a good time. They're currently having one of the biggest global financial crises. Well, it begins all the way back in the 1990s with the Lebanon Civil War, which ended in the Taif Agreement, which basically ended up handing out large sums of money to the rival factions within the country. But what this actually ended up doing was giving the wealthy large portions of control over the government, which has resulted in large barriers to both economic growth and social justice. This has underpinned 30 years of extreme income inequality, which has pretty much resulted in the state of the country as it is today.
So, in 2019, they had a series of protests. What happened there?
Well, pretty much in 2019, the government, absolute buffoons, released a extremely, we'll just say, controversial fiscal policy on taxation, which involved taxing 20% of daily internet calls. Fed up with the inequality and the clear income disparity, the masses of Lebanese took to the streets.
Wow, that sounds like a really big crisis.
Speaking of big crises, how's Cuba going, David?
Look, Ryan, it could be better. Since 1959, when Fidel Castro marched into Havana and seized power in a communist revolution, Cuba's relationship with the Western world has deteriorated, and they began increasingly reliant on the USSR.
So what's happened since then, David?
Look, you think that it would have gotten better, but it's only gotten worse. Successive US and Western trade embargoes have decreased Cuba's economic activity and restricted their exports to the rest of the world. Their planned economy combined with poor economic management is a recipe for disaster. Poor economic growth, poverty, and inequality is still rampant in the country, with average daily incomes around 20 US dollars.
So how's the government responded to that in terms of monetary and fiscal management?
Look, as I said before, Cuba is a planned economy, with over 76% of its employees working in the public sector. As a result, poor economic management really has a disastrous impact on the country. They actually have little control over the monetary policy. They don't have bonds, they don't have any kind of primary or secondary debt market. In fact, people aren't allowed to take out loans at all. As a result, they have little control over their interest rate and thus inflation, which is projected to reach between 400 and 900% later this year. Well, how has Lebanon responded?
Well, Lebanon's not great either. Obviously, I mentioned before their fiscal policy is heavily skewed towards the more rich, cutting pensions, funding for organizations that help the disadvantaged, public sector wages, etc. Monetary policy is basically summed up in keep borrowing to pay for borrowed costs. This has resulted in a public debt which reached 7 times GDP in 2017. And right now, following the collapse of their economy, their currency has fallen from 1,500 to 15,000 per US dollar. You mentioned that Cuba had no private lending at all. So what's the impact of that?
Look, as I said earlier, open market operations are impossible. Basically, Cuba has no control over monetary policy. However, it also has implications in regards to their fiscal policy. That means that there's a heavy restriction on entrepreneurship. As a result, there's little private sector activity in the economy, and thus there's little revenue from corporation tax. Cuba doesn't tax the income of public sector workers, and given that is a significant part of the population, Cuba really suffers to collect enough revenue to keep the country going. Cuba cannot raise public sector wages to match inflation. As a result, many consumer goods, such as basic food and medicine, are almost impossible to buy right now, and this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So both our countries have quite a lot of debt. What options are available for Lebanon?
Well, the main issue Lebanon needs to address currently is alleviating the just absolutely ginormous scale of their debt. One way they could do this, which would be sustainable for the future, would be implementing progressive income tax system like we have here in Australia. What about Cuba?
Look, Cuba needs to raise government revenue, and given their current income tax system, there's very little coming from that. If they implemented a progressive income tax, this would only slightly increase the tax burden for the public sector employees on lower wages and also reduce inequality in the country. Can Lebanon get any help at all internationally?
Well, actually, the World Bank has already agreed to lend Lebanon $246 million to help social security and increase that safety net. So what options does Cuba have currently?
Normally, that they would be able to receive a bailout from the IMF. However, in 1958, they borrowed 12.5 million from the IMF, around 200 million now, and they never paid it back. As a result, they've been kicked out and haven't rejoined since. So the first steps Cuba would need to reestablish conversations with the IMF to be able to access the almost 800 billion they have available. So if you could summarize for us, how's Lebanon in general?
Well, they're absolutely screwed, David. How's Cuba?
Yeah, they're screwed too.